Good morning.
Good morning.
Did you notice the little joke in the order of service this morning? There's a little joke buried in the order of service this morning. I'm guessing Cindy would have noticed, except that she was sort of occupied. She usually pays close attention to the order of service. So we read a piece of the Noah story, and then we were supposed to sing a song called The Gift of Water, which I'm guessing would not have been Noah's favorite song. I tried. So this, as Linda said, this next while during Lent, we're going to focus on the idea of covenant. This contract between God and the world. The Bible has a number of covenants, and we're going to be walking our way through them. Now this week, the material we're using for planning our worship services said that the focus is supposed to be on the fact that the covenant that God makes is not just with covenant between God and human beings, but is in fact between God and all of creation. That all of creation is included in God's love and in God's care. And as I thought about that, in the context of this group, I thought, with a bunch of tree huggers like I've got here, we really don't need to hear that. That this is seriously news to a lot of Christians, but not to you guys. And so we'll get there. But I wanted to start somewhere else this morning. And I wanted to start with the story of Noah. And the reason I wanted to start with the story of Noah is that I'm guessing for a lot of us, the story of Noah is one of those stories that we encountered very early as a children's story. Because it makes such a cute little children's story, right? With the animals 2 by 2 and the ark, right? And all of this sort of stuff. And there's dozens of songs and hundreds or probably thousands of little board books and games and all of this sort of children's stuff. But for many of us, I'm guessing the story stayed there. And we really aren't sure what to do with the adult story. Because it is an adult story in its own way, too. And so I want to think about that just a little bit with you to help you get it into your adult world as well, and not leave it there with the cute little picture books. So there's actually a number of ways to do this, right? One of the most obvious ways to do this is just over there in Kentucky with this thing called the Ark Encounter, where this organization has built a full-size ark, right? And they have an accompanying, of course, a very nice website, and their purpose is very clear. It's right there on the website. It says, the Bible is true. Right? So that's the point of this massive thing, to prove that the Bible is true and that the ark is a historical event, right? Because they want to convince you that historical and truth is the same thing. Okay, we can debate that. What's interesting for me in the Ark Encounter and this huge display is that while on the one hand it proves for people who want to believe that the story of Noah's Ark is a historical story about something that happened in the physical world, at the same time it proves the opposite thing. Because this ark, that ark, cost $100 million to build. It took 1,000 craftsmen using over 3 million board feet of lumber. And I'm thinking, Noah and his sons somehow coming up with 3 million board feet of lumber without iron. How are you going to come up with 3 million board feet of cut lumber if you don't have even iron to cut it with? So in some ways that represents for me this sort of, it's so very postmodern, because it represents at the same time both the proof and the disproof of the same theory. And you can take it either way. There it is. But that's not the only way to take this story. In fact, another much better way to take the story is to actually read the thing. And when people, I've done this with groups before, and when adults read this story, they often find it very surprising, because the story in the Bible is really quite a bit different than the one in your little cute picture books that you might have in your head. Right? For example, the ark story is in fact the longest story in the Bible. There is no other single story in the Bible that's as long as this. It's all of Genesis 6, 7, and 8. There really is no other single story in the Bible that's 3 whole chapters long. Right? There's lots of little, right? Like the David stories are longer, but it's a bunch of little incidents together. Right? Or the Abraham story is a bunch of little incidents. Or the Gospels, well, it's just sort of a bunch of little incidents. But this is one sort of story. And it's a long story, and it's a complicated story. And it's a confusing story. It's a confusing story because at one point it says the animals 2 by 2 into the ark, and then over there it says, well, actually came in 7 by 7 into the ark, and then over there it says, well, actually it was the clean animals that came in 7 by 7, and the unclean animals came in 2 by 2. Right? And so what happened, apparently, is that at some point this same story existed in a number of different versions, and the people who put the Bible together decided, we're just going to mix them all up together. Put them all in there. You figure it out. Right? And so it's a complicated story. It's a difficult story to figure out what's going on. Another interesting part of the adult story is when you take seriously what it says about the world, right? And what it says about God. So this is where we start the story. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, it says, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually." Wow, that's pretty bad. And so then God does this whole, right, ark thing. Well, Noah does the ark thing, and God does the flood thing. Right, and then the birds sent out and stuff like that. Like I said, it's a long and complicated story. And then we get to chapter 8, verse 20 and 21, which we read. And it says, and God says, because I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. So at the end of the flood, God says, you know that problem we started with? It's still there. And this whole flood thing, it didn't work. What do we do with a story where God tries something and it doesn't work? What kind of God is this who tries something and it doesn't work? Now, honestly, I have bad days where I think the same thing about the church. That if you read the negative history of the church, you can easily come to the same conclusion, and people have. Like, the church is God's grand experiment to try something, and it didn't work. Right? Of course, you can also read the good history of the church and see the opposite. But here we have a story, right, that is complicated right to its very roots. Right? That God tries something, and it didn't work. And then we get to the rainbow, which we also read. In the story in your head, what's the purpose of the rainbow? It's a sign of the covenant, right? Anything else in your head spark about the purpose of the rainbow?
Hope.
Hope?
For the future.
Okay.
What
Anything
struck
else?
me today was that it's to remind God.
Yeah. And again, what kind of story is it where God has to be reminded? We don't usually think about God forgetting stuff. Right? So, I mean, this is all just to say that, right, as a children's story, it's very cute, and it's very simple, and it's very nice. And as an adult story, it's very complicated. And I haven't got to, like, the complicated bits yet. These are just sort of a few of them. So I would encourage you sometime to actually read the whole thing and chew over it, because there's a lot there. But clearly one of the things that I'm supposed to talk about this morning is the fact that in the end, the covenant that God establishes with Noah and his family, right, includes all of humankind, but also includes the animals. Right, which is, of course, the point, right, for saving the animals to begin with. God says, no, you know, the animals are not the problem here, so let's save the animals. Obviously, you can't save them all because you can't build a boat that large, but we can save enough so that they can continue to, because they're not the problem. Some people have this notion that God someday is going to come and destroy the natural world and save the people, which is sort of like the surgeon going in and destroying the body and saving the cancer. Right? Because the people are the problem. Right? The cats are fine. Well, the cats maybe not, right? But the rest of the creatures are fine. Right? And so, right, God has this notion that creation was good. Right? And people may have been, again, one of those ideas that didn't work out as good as God had thought. But, the elephants are fine at least. So then I turned to Mark chapter 1. And what struck me in Mark chapter 1 was the balance in the way it's written. This balance between the spiritual and the physical in the way it's written. So I want you to turn in your bulletin, into your insert. And I want this half of the room to read the light print, and this half of the room to read the dark print. Okay, just to get this, to show you this sense of, so you guys get to read sort of the spiritual part, and you guys get to read the physical part. Okay, so let's start over here. In those days, Jesus came
From Nazareth of Galilee,
and was baptized by John
in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water,
he saw the heavens torn apart, and the Spirit descending
like a dove,
on him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased." And the Spirit immediately drove him out
into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days,
tempted by Satan,
and he was with the wild beasts,
and the angels waited on him. I just found that very striking, the way those two voices in there kept going back and forth. And again, we sometimes have this temptation to read the Gospels very spiritually. But there's a very clear sense of the physical in there. And part of it, of course, is that we don't know the physical very well. Right? When the text says that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee, that really doesn't mean much to most of us. But fortunately, we live in West Virginia. And West Virginia is geophysically a lot like Galilee is. So, imagine this. Right? You're in Fairmont, West Virginia. But there are no roads. And so take out all the highways, take out all the state roads, take out all the little roads, put in footpaths. Okay? Same rough number of people, footpaths all over. Okay? And then, in those days, Jesus came from Fairmont to Cheat River. What, a 15, 20-mile walk. Footpaths, farmers in between, little villages, places to stop. Right? But rugged terrain. Not a simple walk. Not a one-day walk, I'm guessing. Right? If you think about walking 15, 20 miles over the West Virginia hills. Very, very physical. Right? And he was coming up out of the water, and the Spirit came down like a dove, again connecting us to the real world. And the story continues that way, and he goes out into the wilderness. And another one of the things that Israel and West Virginia have in common is that you're never very far from wilderness. It's not very hard to get out into the wilderness here. And he was there for 40 days, right? Which is always this, right? I mean, the wilderness is always kind of two things at the same time. Right? In some sense, it's very spiritual. Right? But in another sense, it's very, very, very physical. Because it's wilderness, and they didn't, right? Their wilderness was pretty darn wild. Right? And finding food would have been tough, and finding water in the wilderness in Israel would have been even tougher. Right? And he was in the wilderness, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts. This would have changed the story a lot. Could have. Right? And the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and was eaten by a jaguar. There are still jaguars in the wilderness around Israel. Right? So, that would have shortened the gospel a lot. Right? And I always think that this last phrase is cheating. Right? He was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. That's just cheating. I mean, seriously. Right? So what this passage speaks to me about is two different balances. Two different balances that I think are useful for us to maintain in the world. And the first is between the spiritual and the physical. And I don't know, right, that you are all different people, and for each of you this balance is at a different place. That some of you may sort of more naturally be inclined to the spiritual things, and you may be a bit sort of uncomfortable in the physical world. You may be a little uncomfortable in your own body, and you're much more happy in your own head. And you like, sort of being transported out of this physical world into the spiritual realm. That is a great thing for you, and there's various ways you do that already. And for you, then, the challenge is to get back into your body, to get back into the physical world of suffering and pain and joy and all of these parts of it, and not to leave it behind. And for others of you, right, the spiritual world might be sort of terra incognito. There's just a whole thing out there that you just don't get. Right? And I encourage you, if you're one of those people, to take some time and to enter the spiritual world, to find ways to get there. Because there are numerous avenues, numerous ways to get yourself into part of the spiritual world, whether it's reading the scripture or prayer or song, right, or meditation, or however you do that. There's a variety of avenues into that, and especially if you don't want to. Right? That's usually a good sign. If that's where you really, really want to go, maybe do it less. Right? But if you really, really don't want to go there, maybe a clue that it's time to go there a little more often, because right, I think balances are always healthy. We are both spiritual and physical creatures. And we're never going to get, most of us are never going to get to whatever a perfect balance looks like. But if you feel a pull away, maybe that's a sign you should be walking toward. The other balance that I see here is the balance between the human and the natural world. And Jesus didn't really have that problem, because in his day the natural world just intruded on you all of the time. It was sort of unavoidable, because they didn't have electricity, and they didn't have running water, and they didn't have sort of all of the modern conveniences that, let's face it, insulate us from the world around us. And again, I'm a big fan of those things, right? I asked for air conditioning last year in the parsonage because I also want to be insulated from the natural world around me for my own comfort. And there's no reason to apologize for that, but it's also important to recognize how much that is true, right? And so I look around the sanctuary and I go, see, we've got the brick, which is, I suppose, just dirt and, mushed together, but it's pretty artificial, and we got all this beautiful wood, but then I thought, like I built this, so I know, and when I touch this, I'm not touching wood. I'm touching polyurethane. Right? And we've got that nice, beautiful natural wood floor back there. But is there any actual wood in that beautiful natural wood floor? I don't know. Right? So we've got all of this stuff that insulates us. And so, okay, that's fine. We can, like I said, we're in West Virginia, we can go out into the wilderness. But it isn't very difficult to go out into the wilderness and meet people who are watching Netflix as they're going through the wilderness. Right? You can sit in your boat and fish and watch Netflix the whole time, can't you? Right? And so, even being in the wilderness, you can find lots of ways to insulate yourself and to isolate yourself from the actual wilderness that you're in. And being in the natural world, right, you can there's still lots of barriers potentially between you and the natural world. So again, I would encourage you to get out there and to experience the fact that, you know, it isn't always pretty. Sometimes it's overwhelmingly beautiful, and sometimes it's just a little ugly out there. Right, on a day like this, you slip and you fall, and the natural world hits you pretty hard. And I'm not asking you to go out and get injured. But I did have a friend a few weeks ago who was asking for help in spiritual disciplines. She was just like throwing out questions, like, so who has any idea what they do for spiritual disciplines? And I said, well, one of the things I do for spiritual disciplines is I do something that has the real possibility of me bleeding. Because there's nothing that focuses the mind quite as much as a whirring saw blade. Because if you have a saw blade, you know, running at 5,000 RPM, and you're not being present, then part of you might suddenly become absent that you don't want to become absent. Right? And so it's remarkable how much, you know, being present. There's just a variety of ways of doing it. So, this is, I think, all part of God's covenant. This is all part of God's covenant because this is all part of God's world. And it does not help us to isolate ourselves either spiritually or physically from God's world. That is not what we were created to be. Amen.